At 36,000 feet over the Aleutian Islands, the temperature inside the cockpit dropped to 50 degrees below zero. The pilot's oxygen mask froze to his face. His hands, even inside fleece-lined gloves, could barely move the control yoke. The twin Allison engines were still running. The airframe was intact. No enemy aircraft had fired a single round. And yet, within the next 11 minutes, this pilot would be dead. Not from combat, not from mechanical failure, but from the airplane itself. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was supposed to be the safest fighter in the American arsenal. 2 engines meant redundancy. Long range meant escort capability. Heavy armament meant firepower no single-engine fighter could match. Military planners called it a revolution. Pilots called it beautiful. And for a brief window in 1942, everyone believed the Lightning had solved the fundamental problem of fighter aviation. They were wrong. The P-38 didn't fail because it was poorly built. It failed because it was too capable. Its range sent pilots farther from rescue than any fighter before it. Its speed introduced aerodynamic phenomena that engineers hadn't yet named. Its altitude ceiling pushed men into environments the human body was never designed to survive, and its complexity meant that a single overlooked detail, a valve, a seal, a gauge, could transform a routine mission into a death sentence. This is the story of the men who flew the Lightning. Not the aces, not the heroes, the ones who climbed into that cockpit and discovered that the machine promising to save them was often the thing that killed them. The belief in the P-38 began before the war. In the late 1930s, the United States Army Air Corps faced a strategic problem that seemed unsolvable. American bombers were being designed to fly deep into enemy territory, far beyond the range of existing escort fighters. Doctrine at the time held that heavily armed bomber formations could defend themselves. Massed, defensive firepower, planners argued, would make fighter escort unnecessary. This assumption would later prove catastrophic, but even those who doubted it had no good alternatives. Single-engine fighters of the era simply couldn't fly far enough to protect bombers over Germany or Japan. Lockheed's proposal was radical. A twin-engine, twin-boom fighter with tricycle landing gear, turbo-supercharged engines, and a centralized nose armament package. The design prioritized range, climb rate, and high-altitude performance. It was heavier than any American fighter before it. It was faster than most, and on paper, it solved everything. The prototype, designated XP-38, flew in January 1939. It crossed the United States in 7 hours and 2 minutes, a record-breaking transcontinental flight that ended in a crash landing when the engines failed on approach. The airframe was destroyed, but the performance data survived. The Lightning could climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. It could reach speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight. It could carry more fuel, more ammunition, and more firepower than any fighter in the American inventory. The Army Air Corps ordered it into production before the design flaws had been fully understood. By the time the United States entered the war, the P-38 was already deployed to defensive units across the Pacific. It was the first American fighter to engage Japanese aircraft over the Aleutian Islands. It was the first to fly long-range interceptions from Australia. And it was among the first to suffer losses that had nothing to do with enemy action. The pattern emerged slowly at first. A flight of P-38s would depart on a routine patrol. Weather conditions would be marginal but acceptable. Enemy contact would be unlikely. And yet, 1 or 2 aircraft wouldn't return. Search parties would find nothing. Radio contact would simply stop. The official reports listed these losses as missing or cause unknown. But the pilots who survived began to notice something troubling. The Lightning was killing them. In the Aleutians, the cold was unlike anything American pilots had trained for. At altitude, lubricants thickened, hydraulic seals cracked, windscreens fogged and froze from the inside. Pilots reported that their control surfaces became sluggish, then unresponsive. Engine instruments gave readings that made no sense. And in the thin, frozen air, the turbo superchargers that gave the P-38 its high-altitude advantage became maintenance nightmares. A single failed seal could cause a compressor to overspeed and disintegrate. The first documented compressibility deaths occurred without warning. Pilots diving to intercept or escape found their aircraft accelerating beyond control limits. At certain speeds, the airflow over the wing and tail created shock waves that disrupted the control surfaces. Pilots reported that pulling back on the yoke did nothing. The nose wouldn't come up. The aircraft continued to accelerate, vibrating violently until it either broke apart or struck the ground. Engineers would later call this phenomenon compressibility tuck. In 1942, pilots called it death. There was no recovery procedure. There was no warning system. There was only the sudden, terrifying realization that the aircraft was no longer responding to human input. The early loss rates should have forced a fundamental reassessment. In some units, more aircraft were lost to non-combat causes than to enemy action. Pilots whispered about the Lightning's dark reputation. Maintenance crews worked around the clock, trying to solve problems that were built into the airframe itself. And yet, the strategic need for long-range escort was so desperate that production continued. This should have ended the story. The problem the P-38 was meant to solve was real, and no existing aircraft could solve it. Before the Lightning, American escort doctrine was built around hope. Planners hoped that bomber formations could defend themselves. They hoped that enemy fighter opposition would be disorganized. They hoped that short-range escorts could at least protect the bombers during the most dangerous phases of flight: takeoff, assembly, and initial penetration. These hopes died over Europe in 1943. The 8th Air Force began strategic bombing operations against occupied Europe with inadequate escort coverage. P-47 Thunderbolts, the primary American fighters available in theater, had excellent performance but limited range. They could escort bombers partway into enemy territory, then had to turn back. What happened next was predictable. German fighters waited until the escorts departed, then attacked the unprotected bomber formations with devastating effectiveness. The losses were staggering. On certain missions, bomber groups lost a quarter of their aircraft. Crews calculated their odds of completing a 25-mission tour and found the mathematics grim. Morale suffered. Replacement crews arrived undertrained and died quickly. The entire strategic bombing campaign was at risk of collapse. The P-38 offered a potential solution. Its range, even in early models, significantly exceeded that of the P-47. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers deeper into Germany than any other American fighter. Its twin engines provided some measure of redundancy over hostile territory, and its heavy nose armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, gave it the firepower to challenge German interceptors. But the Lightning hadn't been designed for the European theater. It had been conceived as a high-altitude interceptor for the defense of the continental United States. Its performance characteristics were optimized for climbing quickly to meet incoming bombers, not for the sustained, fuel-conscious escort missions that Europe demanded. This mismatch would prove costly. The turbo superchargers that gave the P-38 its altitude advantage were temperamental in the cold, damp conditions of northern Europe. The Allison engines, while reliable in moderate climates, struggled with the condensation and icing that formed during long climbs through overcast skies. Pilots reported that their engines would run rough lose power, or fail entirely without warning. Maintenance crews in England found themselves dealing with problems that rarely occurred in the American Southwest, where most P-38 training took place. The cockpit heating system, designed for the relatively brief interception missions of home defense, was inadequate for the 4- and 5-hour escort flights over Europe. Pilots flew in temperatures that approached those of the Aleutians. Their hands grew numb. Their feet lost sensation. Their oxygen masks accumulated moisture that froze against their skin. Some pilots suffered frostbite so severe that they couldn't feel the controls. Others reported that the cold affected their judgment, slowing their reactions and clouding their decision-making. And yet, despite these problems, the P-38 was pressed into service because nothing else could do the job. The first Lightning groups arrived in England in mid-1942, but it took months before they were operational in significant numbers. Training facilities were overwhelmed. Spare parts were scarce. Pilots who had mastered the aircraft in the clear skies of California found themselves struggling with weather conditions they had never encountered. The learning curve was steep, and the tuition was paid in lives. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a single innovation but a gradual accumulation of hard-won knowledge. Maintenance crews learned which components failed most often in European conditions and developed preemptive replacement schedules. Pilots learned to manage their engines differently, adjusting mixture and manifold pressure to reduce the strain on turbo superchargers. Tactics evolved to minimize the time spent at the highest altitudes, where the cold was most dangerous and the engines most vulnerable. Dive flaps were introduced in later models to address the compressibility problem. These small surfaces, mounted under the wings, disrupted the shock waves that caused control loss during high-speed dives. They didn't eliminate the danger, but they gave pilots a fighting chance of recovery. The difference was measurable. Aircraft that would have been lost to compressibility in 1943 could be saved in 1944, if the pilot knew what to do and acted quickly enough. By early 1944, the P-38 was contributing meaningfully to the escort mission over Europe. Losses to mechanical causes had decreased, tactics had improved, and the psychological impact of seeing American fighters over Berlin for the first time was immense. For the first time, the crisis was under control. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. The success of the P-38 in extended escort missions created its own problems. Demand for Lightning pilots exceeded the capacity of training programs to produce them. Men who had barely mastered the basics were rushed to operational units. They arrived in theater with fewer than 50 hours in the aircraft. Some had never experienced the conditions they would encounter on their first combat mission. The P-38 was not a forgiving aircraft for inexperienced pilots. Its twin-engine configuration created asymmetric thrust problems that single-engine pilots had never encountered. If one engine lost power during takeoff or landing, the aircraft would yaw violently toward the dead engine. Correcting this required immediate, precise rudder input. Hesitation meant loss of control. Many training accidents occurred during this critical phase, and the pattern continued in combat zones where runways were short, surfaces were uneven, and margins for error were thin. The counter-rotating propellers, designed to eliminate torque effects during normal flight, created their own complications. Pilots transitioning from single-engine fighters found the control feel unfamiliar. The aircraft responded differently to throttle inputs. The coordination between hands and feet that had become instinctive in simpler aircraft had to be relearned. The cockpit itself was complex by the standards of the era. Pilots managed 2 throttles, 2 mixture controls, 2 propeller controls, 2 sets of engine instruments, and a turbo supercharger system that required constant attention at altitude. A single mismanaged setting could cause an engine to run too rich or too lean, leading to power loss or mechanical damage. The cognitive load was substantial, particularly in combat situations where attention was divided between flying, fighting, and surviving. Experienced pilots developed scan patterns, systematic ways of checking instruments in sequence to catch problems before they became emergencies. New pilots hadn't developed these habits. They fixated on the gun sight during combat and missed the warning signs on their instrument panels. They pushed engines beyond safe limits without realizing it. They made small errors that compounded into catastrophic failures. The attrition among new pilots was disproportionate. Statistical patterns from various operational records suggest that pilots were most vulnerable during their first several missions. Those who survived this initial period developed the skills and instincts necessary for longer-term survival. But the learning period was unforgiving. The aircraft didn't distinguish between inexperience and incompetence. It simply responded to inputs, correctly or incorrectly applied, with mechanical indifference. A full mission in the P-38 over Europe was an exhausting ordeal that began long before takeoff. Pilots woke in darkness, ate breakfast without appetite, and attended briefings where they learned their targets, routes, and expected opposition. The tension in those briefing rooms was palpable. Men who had seen friends die the day before sat next to replacements who didn't yet understand what they were facing. Pre-flight procedures took time. Each of the two engines had to be checked individually, control surfaces had to be tested, oxygen systems had to be verified, drop tanks had to be secured. Any oversight, any shortcut, could prove fatal hours later when the aircraft was 300 miles from the nearest friendly base. Takeoff was dangerous. The P-38 was heavy, especially with full fuel and drop tanks. It required more runway than single-engine fighters. In wet conditions, the tricycle landing gear could hydroplane. In crosswinds, the twin-boom configuration created directional stability challenges. Pilots who became airborne found themselves immediately climbing through thick overcast, their instruments the only reference in a world without horizon. Assembly over England was a navigational challenge. Hundreds of aircraft from dozens of airfields had to rendezvous at precise times and altitudes. In clear weather, this was merely difficult. In the clouds that characterized northern Europe for much of the year, it was dangerous. Mid-air collisions occurred. Aircraft became separated and never found their formations. Pilots who couldn't locate their groups faced a choice: return home and face questions about their courage, or continue alone and face the enemy without mutual support. The flight across the Channel and into occupied Europe was monotonous and tense. Pilots flew for hours, managing fuel consumption, monitoring engine temperatures, scanning the sky for threats that could appear at any moment. The cold seeped into the cockpit. The oxygen mask chafed. The shoulders ached from holding the control yoke steady against the turbulence and the weight of the aircraft. Combat, when it came, was brief and violent. German fighters attacked with discipline and aggression, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft. The P-38's heavy armament was effective, but its size and twin-boom silhouette made it easy to identify at distance. Enemy pilots knew its vulnerabilities: its relative lack of maneuverability compared to single-engine fighters, its tendency to lose energy in sustained turning fights, its susceptibility to damage to the coolant systems that ran through the wing booms. The flight home was often the most dangerous part. Damaged aircraft struggled to maintain formation. Pilots with wounded engines faced the mathematics of fuel and distance. Navigational errors, easily made when exhausted and stressed, could lead aircraft over heavily defended areas or out over the North Sea. The English coast, when it finally appeared through the haze, was a sight that brought tears to the eyes of men who had given up hope of seeing it again. Landing was the final test. Pilots with damaged hydraulics had to pump down landing gear by hand. Those with wounded aircraft had to judge their approach, speed, and angle without the normal feedback of a healthy airframe. Crashes on landing were common. Sometimes the aircraft held together. Sometimes it didn't. For the men who flew the Lightning over Europe, the enemy wasn't the hardest part anymore. By mid-1944, the German fighter force was in crisis. The combination of sustained combat losses, fuel shortages, and pilot attrition had degraded its effectiveness. American escort fighters, including the P-38, encountered less resistance on missions that would have been suicidal a year earlier. The skies over Germany were becoming, by relative measure, safer. The reasons were cumulative. Allied bombing had disrupted German fuel production, forcing the Luftwaffe to ration aviation gasoline. New German pilots received less training than their predecessors, making them more vulnerable in combat. Experienced German pilots, the ones who had survived years of war, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Germany was running out of people who knew how to fight in the air. For American planners, this was welcome news. For American pilots, it changed the nature of their missions, but didn't eliminate the danger. Fewer enemy fighters meant fewer dramatic dogfights, but it didn't mean fewer losses. The P-38 continued to disappear over Europe, and increasingly, the causes had nothing to do with German weapons. The threat that American intelligence had feared most, a new generation of German aircraft that could outperform anything in the Allied arsenal, materialized too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. Jet-powered fighters appeared over Germany in the final months of the war. They were faster than anything the Allies could field. They could climb above the bomber formations and attack from angles that conventional fighters couldn't match. But there weren't enough of them, and they weren't supported by the fuel, the pilots, or the infrastructure necessary to alter the strategic situation. American pilots who encountered these jets reported a mixture of awe and frustration. The enemy aircraft could engage or disengage at will. They couldn't be chased down. They couldn't be caught in a turning fight, because they didn't need to turn. But they also couldn't be everywhere. Their numbers were too small. Their operational readiness was too inconsistent. They appeared, made a few passes, and vanished. For every American aircraft they destroyed, there were hundreds of sorties they couldn't contest at all. The reduction in enemy opposition created a psychological shift that proved dangerous. Pilots who had learned to fly with constant vigilance began to relax. The sense of imminent threat that had kept them sharp began to fade. Complacency crept into cockpits where survival had once depended on paranoid alertness. The P-38 was still a demanding aircraft. The engines still required careful management. The cold still sapped strength and judgment. The fuel calculations still had to be precise. But pilots who had grown accustomed to the adrenaline of combat found routine missions numbing. They became careless with procedures they had once followed religiously. They took shortcuts that seemed harmless until they weren't. The losses continued. Aircraft went down over Europe with no enemy in sight. Pilots reported engine failures, fuel exhaustion, navigational errors. Some simply vanished, their fates never determined. The statistical record of the final months of the air war reveals a pattern that contradicts the triumphalist narrative of Allied air supremacy. American aircraft kept dying, even as the enemy faded. The quiet skies were not safe skies. That's when losses accelerated. The P-38 Lightning was designed with certain assumptions about how it would be used and what would damage it. Those assumptions didn't always align with operational reality. The twin-engine configuration provided redundancy, but it also created vulnerability. The Allison V-1710 engines were liquid-cooled, unlike the air-cooled radials used in aircraft like the P-47. This meant they required coolant systems, radiators, hoses, pumps, and fluid that ran through the wing booms. A single bullet or piece of shrapnel that penetrated a coolant line would cause rapid loss of engine function. The pilot might have minutes to react, or he might have seconds. The difference depended on where the damage occurred and how quickly the coolant drained. Air-cooled engines could absorb significant punishment and keep running. Cylinders could be damaged, fins could be shot away, and the engine would continue to produce power. Liquid-cooled engines offered no such tolerance. Once the coolant was gone, the engine would overheat and seize. There was no middle ground. The concentration of armament in the nose, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, was tactically advantageous but created its own risks. Unlike wing-mounted guns that fired in a converging pattern, the nose guns fired parallel to the aircraft's axis. This simplified aiming and increased hit probability at range, but it also meant that the ammunition storage and feed systems were located directly in front of the pilot. A catastrophic failure in this area, a cook-off, a jam that caused a round to detonate in the breech, would be immediately fatal. The twin-boom design placed the pilot in a central nacelle with limited rearward visibility. In combat, this meant that attacks from the rear quarter were difficult to detect. Enemy pilots learned to exploit this blind spot. The P-38's size and distinctive silhouette made it easy to track at distance, allowing attackers to position themselves advantageously before committing to an attack. The turbo-supercharger system, essential for high-altitude performance, was mechanically complex and failure-prone. The turbines spun at extremely high speeds, driven by exhaust gases from the engines. A bearing failure or blade separation could cause the turbine to disintegrate, sending shrapnel into the engine nacelle or wing structure. Some of these failures occurred without warning, turning a healthy aircraft into an uncontrollable wreck in seconds. The cockpit environment at high altitude was hostile to human survival. The P-38 could operate at altitudes exceeding 40,000 feet, but the life support systems weren't designed for extended exposure to those conditions. Cabin heating was inadequate. The canopy seal allowed cold air to infiltrate. The oxygen system, while functional, required constant monitoring to prevent hypoxia or oxygen toxicity. Pilots operating at the edge of the aircraft's altitude envelope were operating at the edge of human physiological limits as well. These design realities shaped the way the P-38 was used and the way its pilots died. The mission profiles that maximized the aircraft's strengths often minimized its margins for error. Long-range escort missions required precise fuel management. The P-38 carried more fuel than most single-engine fighters, but it also burned more. The twin engines, even at cruise settings, consumed roughly twice what a Mustang or Thunderbolt would use. Drop tanks extended range but created their own problems: drag that reduced performance, release mechanisms that sometimes failed, fuel transfer systems that occasionally malfunctioned. A pilot who lost a drop tank early in a mission faced a decision: continue with reduced fuel reserves or abort and face the questions that followed. The mathematics were unforgiving. Every minute of combat maneuvering burned fuel at rates far exceeding cruise consumption. A pilot who engaged the enemy extensively might find himself with insufficient fuel to return home. The options at that point were grim. Attempt to reach the English coast and risk ditching in the Channel, divert to an alternate field and risk landing in unfamiliar or hostile territory, or bail out over occupied Europe and become a prisoner or an evader. The mission profile that offered the least margin for error was the fighter sweep. Offensive patrols intended to find and destroy enemy aircraft wherever they could be located. These missions required aggressive tactics, extended penetration into hostile territory, and willingness to engage enemies who had every advantage of position and numbers. Pilots who committed to these engagements often found themselves far from friendly territory, with damaged aircraft, depleted fuel, and wounded comrades. Once committed, escape became increasingly difficult. The distance to safety grew with every mile of penetration. Damage that might be survivable close to home became fatal over enemy territory. The P-38's range, its greatest strategic asset, became its pilot's greatest vulnerability when things went wrong. The unexpected source of losses that accumulated over time was not enemy action in the traditional sense. It was the accumulation of small problems, mechanical, environmental, human, that turned manageable situations into fatal ones. The engine that ran a little rough, the fuel gauge that read higher than actual, the navigation error that added 20 miles to the return route, the cold that slowed reaction times just enough, the fatigue that caused a momentary lapse in attention. These factors didn't show up in combat reports. They didn't generate dramatic narratives. They simply killed pilots, quietly and consistently, throughout the campaign. The statistics that emerged after the war painted a picture that contradicted the popular mythology. The P-38 lost more aircraft to operational causes than many of its contemporaries. The percentage varied by theater and time period, but the pattern was consistent. The Lightning was a demanding aircraft that extracted a toll from its pilots, even when the enemy wasn't present. This was the truth that didn't fit the legend. For P-38 pilots who survived being shot down over occupied Europe, the ordeal was just beginning. The aircraft's size made low-altitude bailouts dangerous. Clearing the twin booms required precise timing and body position. Pilots who escaped the aircraft often landed injured in hostile territory, far from any prospect of rescue. The immediate aftermath of a bailout was critical. A pilot who came down in a populated area faced rapid capture. One who landed in open country had a chance of evasion. The resistance networks that operated throughout occupied Europe could sometimes help downed airmen reach neutral territory, but contact with these networks was uncertain and dangerous. Many pilots were captured within hours of landing. German treatment of captured airmen varied considerably. Officially, prisoners were protected by the Geneva Convention and were supposed to receive treatment appropriate to their rank and status. In practice, the experience depended heavily on who captured them and where. Pilots captured by regular military forces were generally treated according to established protocols. Those captured by civilian authorities, police, or irregular forces faced greater uncertainty. Interrogation was standard. German intelligence services had developed sophisticated techniques for extracting information from captured airmen. The process typically began with isolation and disorientation, followed by interrogation sessions that alternated between apparent friendliness and implicit threat. Many pilots discovered that their interrogators already knew more about their units, aircraft, and missions than they had expected. The Germans had built extensive files on American air units through captured documents, prisoner debriefs, and signals intelligence. The journey from capture to permanent camp could take days or weeks. Pilots moved through a series of transit facilities, each with its own conditions and dangers. Some were held temporarily in local jails, where they were exposed to civilian hostility. Bombing had created deep resentment among German civilians, and American airmen were sometimes targets of that anger. Incidents of violence against prisoners, while not universal, occurred with enough frequency to create genuine fear among captured pilots. The permanent camps varied in conditions. Stalag Luft facilities, designed specifically for airmen, were generally preferable to mixed camps or temporary facilities. Even so, conditions deteriorated as the war progressed, and German resources became strained. Food grew scarce, heating became inadequate, medical care ranged from limited to non-existent. For pilots captured late in the war, the collapse of German infrastructure created additional dangers. As Allied forces advanced, prisoners were moved repeatedly to prevent liberation. These forced marches, often conducted in winter conditions with inadequate clothing and supplies, killed significant numbers of men who had survived combat, capture, and months of imprisonment. The proximity of liberation made these deaths particularly cruel. The psychological impact of captivity extended far beyond the war. Pilots who returned from German prisons carried experiences that many never discussed. The loss of control, the uncertainty, the fear, and the guilt of survival while others died. These burdens didn't disappear with liberation. Many former prisoners struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, though that terminology didn't exist at the time. Even surviving the mission didn't mean safety. The Pacific theater presented a completely different set of challenges for P-38 pilots. The distances were oceanic. The terrain was tropical. The enemy was different in doctrine, equipment, and determination. The geography of the Pacific War was defined by water. Island bases were separated by hundreds or thousands of miles of open ocean. Navigational errors that might result in a diversion to an alternate field in Europe meant death in the Pacific. There were no alternate fields. There was only water. The P-38's range, which made it useful in Europe, made it essential in the Pacific. No other American fighter in the early war period could cover the distances required for offensive operations from Australia, New Guinea, or the scattered island chains that served as forward bases. The Lightning became the primary long-range fighter for American forces in the theater, a role it had never been specifically designed to fill. The environment was brutal. Tropical humidity attacked everything. Electrical systems corroded, rubber seals deteriorated, moisture infiltrated instruments, fuel systems, and optical equipment. Maintenance crews fought a constant battle against decay that began the moment aircraft arrived in theater. The heat was as dangerous as the cold had been in northern Europe, though in different ways. Cockpit temperatures during ground operations and low-altitude flight could exceed human tolerance. Pilots suffered heat exhaustion during lengthy missions. The physical demands of flying in tropical conditions drained energy and reduced alertness. Japanese opposition in the Pacific was formidable in the early war years. Japanese pilots had extensive combat experience from operations in China and had developed tactics well suited to their aircraft and circumstances. Their fighters were generally lighter, more maneuverable, and better suited to the turning fights that characterized air combat over the Pacific. The P-38's advantages, speed, climb rate, firepower, required disciplined tactics to exploit. Pilots who allowed themselves to be drawn into turning engagements with Japanese fighters often lost. The P-38's diving ability was crucial. American tactics evolved to emphasize speed, altitude advantage, and slashing attacks that didn't allow enemies to engage on equal terms. Pilots learned to attack from above, dive through enemy formations, and use their speed to escape before the more maneuverable Japanese fighters could respond. This required tactical discipline that new pilots sometimes lacked. The toll of non-combat losses in the Pacific was even more severe than in Europe. Navigation over water with limited landmarks demanded precision that exhausted pilots often couldn't sustain. Weather systems in the tropical Pacific could form with terrifying speed, transforming clear skies into walls of turbulence and rain that no aircraft could penetrate safely. Pilots who became separated from their formations faced solitary journeys, across hundreds of miles of featureless ocean with fuel states that offered no margin for error. Search and rescue in the Pacific was limited by the same distances that made the missions dangerous. Pilots who went down at sea might drift for days before being found, if they were found at all. Survival gear improved as the war progressed, but the ocean remained fundamentally hostile to human life. Sharks, exposure, dehydration, and despair killed men who had survived their aircraft's failure. Navigation in the Pacific required skills that many pilots hadn't developed. Dead reckoning over water, calculating position based on compass heading, airspeed, and time, was subject to cumulative errors that grew with distance. Wind drift, compass deviation, and timing errors could place an aircraft miles from its calculated position without any indication of trouble until fuel ran low and the expected landfall failed to appear. The consequences of navigational errors in the Pacific were absolute. A pilot who became lost over the ocean couldn't land in a field and ask for directions. He couldn't spot a city and identify his location. There was only water, stretching to every horizon, indifferent to his predicament. Some units developed navigational practices that reduced losses. Flight leaders with strong navigation skills guided their formations. Pilots learned to cross-check positions with wingmen. Radio homing systems, when available, provided some assistance. But the fundamental problem remained. The Pacific was too big, and the margins were too thin. Weather in both theaters killed more pilots than enemy action in many operational periods. The P-38, with its altitude capability and range, was often sent through weather systems that other aircraft avoided. In Europe, the primary weather threat was icing. The thick clouds that blanketed northern Europe for much of the year contained moisture that froze on contact with cold aircraft surfaces. Ice accumulated on wings, changing their aerodynamic characteristics. It accumulated on control surfaces, reducing their effectiveness. It accumulated on propeller blades, creating vibrations that could tear engines from their mounts. It accumulated on pitot tubes, destroying the instruments that pilots needed to maintain controlled flight. The P-38's turbo supercharger system was particularly vulnerable to icing. The induction system drew air through passages that could become restricted by ice formation. The intercoolers, designed to reduce the temperature of compressed air, could become blocked. Engine performance degraded, often gradually enough that pilots didn't recognize the danger until power loss became critical. Flying blind through thick clouds with ice accumulating on every surface was terrifying. Pilots reported that they could hear the ice cracking and breaking away, could feel the aircraft's handling change as the aerodynamic shape was altered. They would descend to warmer altitudes when possible, hoping to melt the accumulation, but descent often meant entering denser clouds or approaching terrain they couldn't see. In the Pacific, the weather threats were different but equally deadly. Tropical thunderstorms contained turbulence that could tear aircraft apart. Updrafts and downdrafts of extreme violence could throw an aircraft thousands of feet in seconds, snapping control surfaces and overstressing airframes. Lightning could destroy electrical systems, ignite fuel, or simply kill the pilot directly. The convergence of weather systems in the tropical Pacific created walls of storms that extended for hundreds of miles. Pilots who encountered these systems faced a choice: attempt to navigate around them, burning fuel and extending already dangerous missions, or try to fly through them and risk destruction. Neither option was good. Both options killed pilots. One operational period that exemplified the weather danger occurred during sustained operations in the Southwest Pacific. Over a series of days, missions launched into deteriorating weather conditions resulted in multiple losses that had nothing to do with enemy action. Aircraft disappeared into storm systems and never emerged. Others returned so damaged by turbulence and ice that they never flew again. The official cause listings read like a catalog of environmental hazards: structural failure, engine failure, fuel exhaustion, missing, presumed lost at sea. The human cost was obscured by the clinical language of operations reports. Each missing entry represented a pilot who climbed into a P-38 that morning expecting to return. He had eaten breakfast, attended a briefing, walked to his aircraft, performed his pre-flight checks. He had lifted off, formed up with his flight, and headed out over the ocean. And somewhere in the vast expanse between takeoff and intended destination, he had ceased to exist. No one saw him die. No one recovered his body. No one knew exactly what had happened. The ocean kept its secrets, and the operational tempo demanded that missions continue regardless. As the war entered its final phase, the logic of attrition continued even though victory was assured. P-38 units flew missions into enemy territory that was collapsing, against opposition that was disintegrating. And they kept dying. The reasons were multiple. Equipment that had been in service for years was wearing out. Maintenance crews worked with spare parts that were increasingly scarce as supply lines prioritized other needs. Engines that should have been overhauled continued flying because there was no time to ground them. Aircraft that should have been retired flew mission after mission because there were targets that needed attacking and no replacement aircraft available. Pilots who had survived months of combat were exhausted in ways that rest couldn't cure. The cumulative stress of repeated missions had depleted their psychological reserves. They made mistakes that fresh pilots wouldn't make, not from lack of skill, but from lack of the mental energy required to fly. Precisely. The acceleration of operations in the final months created pressure to fly more missions, more frequently, with less recovery time between them. Strategic demands drove operational tempo beyond sustainable limits. Pilots who needed rest flew instead. Aircraft that needed maintenance launched instead. The machinery of war ground forward on momentum, even as it consumed the people who operated it. New pilots continued to arrive, still undertrained, still unfamiliar with the aircraft and the conditions. They died in the same patterns that had killed their predecessors: engine failures, fuel miscalculations, navigational errors, weather encounters. The lessons that experienced pilots had learned through survival were passed down imperfectly. Each new pilot had to learn his own lessons, and learning in the P-38 was expensive. The statistical record of the final months reveals a grim reality. Losses continued at rates that contradicted the narrative of assured victory. Men died in accidents, in weather, in mechanical failures, in the accumulated consequences of exhaustion and haste. The dying didn't stop because the shooting was nearly over. Some of the final losses occurred on missions that served little strategic purpose. Targets that had been attacked repeatedly were attacked again because the operational machinery had been set in motion and couldn't easily be stopped. Pilots flew through flak over objectives that were already destroyed, absorbing damage that might kill them on the way home. The war had its own momentum, and that momentum was indifferent to individual survival. The feeling among pilots in the final weeks was complex. Hope of survival grew as the end approached, but so did fear of being killed in the final days. The idea of dying when the war was almost over, of surviving everything only to fall at the last moment, created a particular kind of dread. Some pilots became more cautious. Others became fatalistic. None of them could control the factors that would determine whether they lived or died. The war was ending. The dying wasn't. In the final months of the Pacific War, one pilot in a P-38 squadron prepared for what would be his last mission. His name appears in operational records, but what survives beyond the basic facts is fragmentary: unit assignments, mission totals, the dates that frame his service. He had flown many missions before this one. He had survived encounters with enemy aircraft. He had navigated across hundreds of miles of ocean and found his way home. He had dealt with mechanical problems, weather systems, and the cumulative fatigue that wore down everyone who flew long enough. By any measure, he was an experienced pilot. The mission briefing that morning was routine. The target was distant, requiring a long overwater flight to reach. Opposition was expected to be light. Weather reports indicated acceptable conditions along the route. The flight would require careful fuel management, as most missions in the Pacific did, but the mathematics appeared favorable. He walked to his aircraft in the early morning darkness. The ground crew had prepared it overnight, and he conducted his pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness that experience had taught. Everything appeared normal. The engines started cleanly. The instruments showed proper readings. He taxied to the runway and waited for his turn to take off. The takeoff was uneventful. He joined his formation and headed out over the water. The flight proceeded according to plan for several hours. Radio communications were routine. The sky was clear. The engines ran smoothly. What happened next exists only in fragments. His aircraft was observed to leave formation at some point during the mission. Whether this was intentional, a response to a mechanical problem or a navigational correction, or involuntary, is unknown. Radio contact was lost. Search aircraft launched the following day found nothing. His squadron completed the mission and returned. His absence was noted, reported, and recorded. The notation in the unit records is: brief, aircraft and pilot lost, cause unknown. The bureaucratic machinery of war processed his disappearance with the same efficiency it had processed thousands of others. He had written a letter home the night before that arrived after the telegram. The contents were ordinary: observations about the weather, comments about the food, expressions of hope that the war would end soon. Nothing in the letter suggested premonition. Nothing suggested that he expected anything other than a routine mission followed by a routine return. His family received the telegram, then the letter, then the official notification that he was presumed dead. There was no body to bury, no crash site to visit, no definitive answer to the question of what had happened. The Pacific had swallowed him and his aircraft without leaving any evidence behind. He was 23 years old. The war ended without him. The formal surrender occurred weeks after his disappearance. The celebrations that swept the Pacific bases reached his squadron, where men who had survived toasted their survival and tried not to think too hard about those who hadn't. His name was read at memorial services alongside others who had been lost in the final months. The chaplain spoke of sacrifice and duty and the cost of victory. The words were familiar, repeated at similar services throughout the war, and they offered what comfort they could. His family waited for word that never came. In the chaos of the immediate post-war period, some missing pilots were recovered from island hospitals, prison camps, or remote areas where they had evaded capture. These returns created hope that extended long past any reasonable expectation. Families kept vigil for months, then years, waiting for the knock on the door that would bring their son or husband or brother home. The knock never came. Official status changed from missing to presumed dead after the prescribed waiting period. The government issued a death certificate based on the presumption of death rather than any evidence of death. There was no grave, no marker, nothing physical to visit or to mourn beside. He existed only in photographs, letters, and the memories of people who had known him. His mother kept his room as he had left it until her own death decades later. His belongings, a watch, a pen, a few books, became relics of a life interrupted. The photographs showed a young man in uniform, smiling, unaware that the image would outlast him by generations. The squadron records eventually made their way to archives, where researchers could piece together the fragmentary story of his service. The operational details revealed nothing about the person, only the missions flown, the aircraft assigned, the dates and targets. The human being behind the statistics had to be imagined rather than documented. His fate represents thousands of similar fates from the Pacific War. The ocean that had been the theater of operations became an unmarked cemetery holding secrets that would never be revealed. Aircraft remained on the seafloor, some still containing the remains of their pilots. The passage of decades changed nothing. The dead remained dead. The missing remained missing. The questions remained unanswered. Today, the P-38 Lightning is celebrated. Museums display lovingly restored examples with explanatory placards describing specifications, performance characteristics, and historical significance. Air shows feature flying specimens that draw crowds who marvel at the distinctive twin-boom silhouette and the sound of two Allisons in harmony. The narrative that accompanies these displays emphasizes success, highest-scoring American ace of the war, interception of Admiral Yamamoto, long-range escort capability that helped break the back of the German fighter force. These are true things, documented things, important things. But they are not the complete story. For every ace who amassed an impressive tally, there were dozens of pilots who died before they could score a single victory. For every successful interception, there were missions that ended in loss without enemy contact. For every triumph of range and firepower, there was a pilot who discovered that the same aircraft that could fly so far from home could also fail so far from help. The Lightning was a magnificent machine. It represented the cutting edge of American engineering and industrial capability. It performed tasks that no other aircraft of its era could perform. Its contributions to victory were real and significant. It was also a demanding machine that killed many of the men who flew it. Its complexity created vulnerabilities. Its capabilities invited missions that pushed beyond safe margins. Its environments, the cold of high altitude, the heat of the tropics, the featurelessness of the ocean, tested pilots in ways that peacetime training couldn't anticipate. The pilots who survived the Lightning understood something that doesn't fit neatly into museum displays or airshow narration. They understood that the aircraft was both their greatest asset and their greatest liability. They understood that survival depended on respect for the machine's limitations as much as exploitation of its capabilities. They understood that luck played a larger role than any of them wanted to admit. When people talk about the P-38 Lightning, they talk about success, about range and speed and firepower, about the distinctive shape that enemy pilots learned to fear and Allied ground troops learned to welcome. But for the people who flew it, success was surviving what came after. After the engines started, after the wheels left the runway, after the formation crossed the coast and headed into whatever waited beyond. The real story of the P-38 isn't written in victory tallies or mission totals. It's written in the faces that don't appear in reunion photographs, in the names that fill memorial walls, in the vast stretches of ocean and forest and mountain that never gave up the aircraft they claimed. The Lightning was beautiful. The Lightning was deadly, and for the men who climbed into its cockpit, the difference between those truths was often impossible to distinguish until it was too late.